Rogue Frequencies. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Matt.
And we talk about punk music and culture, but not in the way you would expect. We're using all things punk as a way to learn more about individual and collective human growth and development. So, as always, we have our little bit of a disclaimer. And today we are looking at two bands that are part of a scene, so to speak. And so we're going to look at short glimpses of their career and work, and then use those as a bit of a juxtaposition. So it's not meant to be critical or definitive or all-inclusive, but simply give us a shared frame of reference to articulate concepts. So today, we are talking about two bands that are fundamental to creating the genre that we now call punk: Misfits and the Ramones. So Matt, do what you do best as our resident historist. Give us some quick history and context of this scene and these two bands in a nutshell.
100%. So I think one of the things that we can just kind of hit right off the bat is in previous episodes, we've talked a lot about the origins of punk and New York City as a place, a scene for punk to grow and to be developed and nurtured in. And so I don't want to retread the same ground over and over again. So let's zoom in, if we could, on the iconic punk rock venue CBGB's, right, which is on the Lower East Side and was in a lot of ways, along with another venue called Max's Kansas City, one of the two premier pillars of the early punk rock scene. And CBGB's plays this massive role in punk because it provides a stage, quite literally, for these up-and-coming bands that are not always defined by their musical talent, but more by their musical exploration and their willingness to take chances. And I wanted to highlight CBGB's here at the start because CBGB's also offered an opportunity that many of these young artists were hungry for: the chance to earn a quick buck. This is the late 1970s, mid to late 1970s, I should say. And the socioeconomic conditions of New York City and the United States more broadly are definitely downwardly trending. And so for many people who were on the margins anyway, middle-class drivers who are now seeing their opportunities to maintain a lifestyle that their parents were used to, or maybe a lifestyle that they were used to, were finding it much more difficult to reach that goal. At the same time, New York had become a haven for artists and lost souls, people who were looking to recreate the atmosphere and the conditions of the Beat Generation and the Greenwich Village folk scene. And so you had a lot of these artistically minded people coming to New York, and they're starting to cluster themselves down on New York's Lower East Side. And it's in that broader context that both of our bands emerge. The Ramones, who are these, New York guys to their core, who are not really at the outset musically talented. I think anybody who wants to get into the history of the Ramones will find that, they, famously went through a series of different drummers, including frontman Joey Ramone trying to be the drummer, but he couldn't even sit on the stool. He was so awkward and out of control. And, Johnny Ramone, who, is iconically known for his guitar riffs and playing with the Ramones, didn't even know how to play. He gets his first guitar at a pawn shop, throws it in a trash bag, off to his first gig. He plays with this really kind of unique picking style that most musicians will look at, Lou Reed amongst them, and say, like, that's not how you play a guitar. So these guys are, they're out there. They want to be musicians. They want to make some money. They want to just find a way to be successful in this New York City context, and CBGB is going to provide them a place to learn and grow and nurture their craft. Over in New Jersey, we've got the Misfits, and the Misfits are very similar. You've got Glenn Danzig and the Kayaffa brothers, and there's a whole slew of rotating guitarists and people who come in and out of the band. But similarly, these are young guys who don't really have a ton of musical talent. However, they're driven by this desire to, make it. They want to become rock and roll musicians. And this is in an era, the Ramones become an official band in 1975. The Misfits become an official band in 1977. Punk as a genre doesn't exist. So these musicians are just looking at kind of trying to find a way to play almost like pop rock in a way that'll get them on the charts and make them some money. And while neither one of these bands is ever going to be a massive commercial success in their prime, both of them later will go on to be recognized as iconic punk rock bands, as you said. But importantly, how they get to this place of iconic rock status is very different. And in the case of the Ramones, they're going to make it because of the work and the effort, and they're going to be a long-lived band through the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. The Misfits are going to burn out fast. They start in 77, they're done in 1982, and their fame, as it were, really doesn't, exist until the 1990s. So in these two bands, we're going to see the DIY ethic. We're going to see the idea of creating the music and the scene that you want, things that we've talked about previously. But I think there's something worth exploring here in kind of the way these bands come up and how it mirrors that Lower East Side New York scene that CBGB was so important in creating.
Yeah, these two bands, as you talk about them, I associate them together. I associate them as origins. And as you and I have dived more deeply into history, really seeing that there's a fine detail of history that's easy to miss. If you're listening to them both in the 90s, as I was, you presume that they had a similar trajectory. However, there's a significant difference here in that, the Misfits make it a few years before they disband. Then popular culture sweeps them back in and on the scene, versus the Ramones, who were pounding the pavement all throughout. Now, both bands have their own story. And so I'd love it if you'd spend a minute telling us about sort of the Ramones' stick-togetherness versus the Misfits falling apart.
Yeah, sure. So we should just say right now, for anybody who wants to get a deeper dive look into both of these bands, there's a great podcast out there, a music history podcast called No Dogs in Space, that do deep dives on both of these bands. And they'll give you like the granular, super well-researched version of what I'm about to say. So if I leave you lacking and wanting a little bit more, definitely check out No Dogs in Space. We'll throw a link up in the description. The Ramones, like I said before, working class guys who come together, in a kind of hodgepodgey sort of way. Their real animating focus. Their big goal was to write a song that would make it on the pop charts, the top 25, and have a hit. They wanted to have a radio song, if you will, that people could listen to and say, like, hey, look, those boys made it. They did good, right? And like I said, that is really animated by the fact that they're these strivers, and all four of the original Ramones are really interested in trying to find a way to really kind of buck this idea that they were losers, like, just to be blunt about it. The reality, though, is that, like, the way that they played, which was really, really fast, their kind of quirkiness, shall we say, in terms of their dress, their appearance, their lack of social skills in a lot of ways, made it really, really difficult for them to break through in a medium of rock and roll in the 1970s that was very aesthetically focused, right? Like the glam rock era, disco, how you look matters. I mean, not for nothing, but I don't think it's a surprise that the big band that comes out of CBGB is Blondie, fronted by Debbie Harry, who was a magazine cover sort of beauty, and the Ramones, definitely with their long hair and their leather jackets and their ripped up jeans and old Converse, they just don't look the part. But what they do have is this unrelenting desire to write this rock and roll hit. And eventually, the likes of Phil Spector, which, say what you will about the man's, psyche and his morality, had an ear for musical talent. He eventually would want to work with the Ramones, and the Ramones are a rock and roll Hall of Fame band. They clearly had the musical ability to land on what they wanted to land on, a hit song. they were in the wrong time period. If the Ramones hadn't broke through with punk in 1977, if they had been there with like Kurt Cobain in 1992, I think we'd talk about this band differently. So like I said before, though, they stick together. They continue to push themselves musically. They develop a skill set, and they find a way to work with one another. Even though this band is highly combative within it, there's a lot of tension between Joey and Johnny Ramone in particular. And I guess I should have said this earlier. They all have the moniker Ramones, which is an homage to like 50s era, early 50s, late 50s and early 60s era female like doo-woppy type groups, where like the Ronettes, for example. But there's no real relation. These aren't brothers. They just look like each other. Flip that and contrast it with the Misfits, who also are a highly internally combative band. Glenn Danzig is very famously a jerk that people do not like because of his combative nature, and the Kayaffa brothers were hard to get along with as well, and highly immature people. But they also landed on a musical style that I think, again, comes out a little bit later, people would have appreciated. And I don't even think that it's like that controversial of a take, even though, like the Misfits aren't a rock and roll Hall of Fame band or whatever. But Static Age, a album recorded in 1978, doesn't get released into the early 90s because of who owned the rights and all the complexities of the music industry. That album blows up. If that album had been there in 79, when a lot of these punk rock albums really started to come through, I think maybe we'd think about the Misfits a little bit differently. But it's that pressure of not having that album being able to be released and arriving late to the same Walk Among Us, which is an all-time great punk rock album, comes out in 1982, right as the band is starting to implode, and a lot of their great songs are coming out on these small self-released singles and EPs. Under that pressure, the band just falls apart. And, regardless of the musicality and the ability, and what was a really prodigious DIY effort, like the Fiend Club, which is immortalized in the second iteration of the Misfits. And we're not going to talk about Misfits number 2, because no thank you. But the Fiend Club was like this mail-away correspondence group that they would send, zines and patches and stickers and stuff to people all over the country who were a part of it. So the bona fides for both bands are here. I think it's the way that they dealt with the moment, the struggle, that really defines them. And I think in a lot of ways, the Ramones and their ability to break through is more indicative of punk rock. And the Misfits, I think, is more indicative of like the nihilistic sort of subcultures of punk that we've kind of referenced before, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth diving into here the impact of adversity. So they both had strife. Both of the bands had dynamic storming, shall we say. Neither of the bands are known for having personalities that are particularly easy to get along with. Yet the Ramones had a glue that the Misfits did not have. And I think that's worth looking at a bit here, where the Ramones, while they started failing up, so to speak, they started with, we don't even know how to play these instruments that we just acquired. They used that to fail upward, and they ever changed their goals and committed to them collectively. And I don't know, or I don't believe, nothing that I've read or listened to or watched has indicated this to be true. But I think they accidentally found a glue in naming themselves collectively. Just by saying, I am so-and-so Ramone, and your brothers, so to speak, in this band are all saying, I am so-and-so Ramone, you are building a collective identity, whether you believe on or you agree on every fine detail or not.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, there's these stories of when the Ramones went to England, and I think it's like The Clash. Joe Strummer talks about this idea that like people thought they were a gang, and they were like, the English crowds and kids are afraid of the Ramones. They think that there's going to be violence, which could not be farther from the truth if you know about these like goofy guys and how, kind of laid back and relaxed they were. But yeah, no, I think that identity piece is really important. And like, let's just be frank about it, that identity, not just the Ramones name, but also the Ramones look, the black leather jacket, torn up jeans look that is so intertwined with punk rock as an aesthetic choice was something that the Ramones did very intentionally. They really played up this identity of us versus the music industry, us versus everybody else, and it really plays well. And I agree with you. I think it's a huge element of their success.
Yeah, the more indicators we can build in, the more we quickly identify with something. So whether it's individually, if I have a goal I want to achieve, not just thinking it, but writing it, saying it, telling other people, having other people state that back to you, all of those different ways get it ingrained faster. In the same way that collectively as a group, the more you visually, auditorially, physically reinforce that group identity, the stronger it will get. We're seeing that in politics right now to the point that politics are a brand. And once you are a brand, there's a second level up of commitment.
I think there's something about the productive nature of things too, right? Like the identity was the band, but they also like had elements of themselves that they retained that were important as well. And then you talking about politics, this makes me think like, when people make their political affiliations, their identity like singular, that's where I think things are problematic, right? Like you give yourself over in a way where you lose yourself. And I think the Ramones did a really good job of committing to each other, committing to the project of making the band successful, but never ever lost a sense of who they were. And they were able to manage that, right? I mean, Joey Ramone started as, he wanted to be a glam rocker, like T-Rex or, Bowie or some of these guys. And he used to have this like crazy outfit, this, big sequin, glittery sort of thing that he'd wear around town, just like in his everyday, persona with these big platform boots and stuff. You can just imagine him walking down the street and people just being like gawking at him, but he knew who he was. Johnny Ramone, even though punk, like we've talked about previously, has definitely been more associated with leftist politics or extreme right politics, Johnny Ramone was kind of just like a middle of the road conservative personality, Reagan voter, all those sorts of things. Joey was very anti-Reagan. And yet they found a way to work with each other. And I think that there's something there about being balanced, committed to the group project, but not losing your sense of who you are. That really made this band possible in a lot of ways.
Yeah, they weren't culty, so to speak.
Yes.
The uniformity that comes from that culty feel. They dressed the same. They named themselves as a part of this band, which allowed actually members to come and go because they knew the cultural identity so easily. CJ could come in and be a Ramone. You didn't have to just like be the perfect cult model.
Right.
And so we see that here, and I think that that's the multidimensionality that you're talking about, that we can be different, but we can be united. And when we look at organizational systems, we can think about work teams, nonprofit teams, even neighborhood groups. You're planning a neighborhood street party. You need people of different talents, different personalities, different skills. Not everybody can, be the person that plans the bake-off in the neighborhood gathering. You also need someone who is going to flip the burgers or provide the kids' activities. You need that diversity. If everybody has the same talent, then you can't pull off anything organizationally as well. And so we see in the Ramones here that there is this individuality, but there is a commitment to the greater goal. And it starts with just to make a buck today.
Yeah.
And it ends up becoming, we want to make a #1 hit, which goes into the whole Phil Spector lore. Please go check it out. It is quite the wild story.
Yeah, that's a really crazy story. Yeah.
What would take us off path. But like just to tease No Dogs in Space, that's a great place to hear that story. Anyway, they adjust their goals over time, but they're always proverbially shooting for the moon, and they land among the stars. And I would say actually they catapulted further even than they thought. They just struggled to see that as success. So what we're hinting at here is as they continue to grow their goals over time, not just make a buck today, they wanted to make a number one hit. Part of that being the buck today, which they never got. They never achieved that. But what they achieved, as you mentioned, is Hall of Fame status because they are essentially the founding fathers of punk. Not the one and only, but they become the most iconic name in the origins of punk. The Misfits show up too, but not at that same level because they couldn't unite with some sort of glue that could hold them together through the internal strife.
Yeah.
Every goal we have will have obstacles along the way. If you can cohese and move through those obstacles together, every time you move through one, you get more bonded.
Yeah, you've talked about on the podcast previously this idea that, there's a commitment to yourself, and then there's the commitment to the people around you. That's something that we've explored a lot. In our Rancid and Clash episode, we explored that a lot. And I think here, when we contrast and juxtapose the two bands, like Joey Ramone was the front man for the Ramones. Johnny Ramone was kind of like this taskmaster who made sure the band got things done. There's this great story when they record their first album and someone comes in to check in on them in day one. They've been in the studio like a couple hours, like, how far are you guys? And he's like, oh, we've only recorded like 9 songs. And the guy's like, are you serious? You've recorded 9 songs already? And Johnny's like, yeah, I know, it's a real failure. Meanwhile, like, everybody else is amazed that they've done that much work already. You've got Dee Dee Ramone, who's the creative back behind the scenes person. And then you've got Tommy, who's kind of just like overarching, just like kind of holding the band together and managing the personalities. The Misfits don't have that. They have Jerry Caiafa and Glenn Danzig. And in a lot of ways, they're at odds with one another. And I think that the difference is the Ramones had, like you said, a collective identity. And I think the Misfits was a vanity project in a lot of ways. And you have this I think it doesn't shine through as a vanity project at first because of some of the intentional camp of the band, this horror rock element, playing up these linkages back to these old 50s and 60s horror movies, and the interests of the band from that kind of like transgressive, like on the fringes of society standpoint. But because I think the band was in a lot of ways just about Glenn Danzig and what Glenn Danzig thought the band could do for him instead of what the band could do for each other, that's part of why the band spins out. And so while there are people capable of doing all the different roles, or go back to your block party analogy to flip the hot dogs and organize, the drinks and all the other things that come with doing an event like that, the Ramones saw how they could support each other and help each other. And I think the Misfits looked at each other as stepping stones towards something else. And I think that comes through in the way that they incorporate their own record label and divided up tasks. And it just, from the beginning, the Misfits are more about this almost sense of self as being the only thing that matters. And I think that's that nihilism that we've seen in other areas of punk as well, and why so many of those bands burn out so fast.
Yeah, there's a difference here, and it sometimes feels subtle, but it's I'm using you to get something versus I'm joining with you to get something.
Yes.
And the joining with you means that you don't always do it exactly the way you want to, but it has more stickiness.
Yeah.
So it makes me think a little bit of like, doing what you love doesn't mean that everything you do as a part of that you are going to love.
Right.
So you have those goals, you have the greater vision of doing what you love, and then an agreement of, I'm going to do the hard things around the edges to have this desired future state. So the taskmasteriness of Johnny, I'm sure most of these guys were ready to like kick him out of the band, like go take a break, like get out of here, like don't be so hard on us. And yet they still, or because of that, they had this achievement. So I'm sure that other guys go home at the end of the day, they're like, get that guy.
Right.
And that guy was needed for the greater good. So there's a bit of an acceptance of maybe the medicine to get what you love, which is a lifetime of playing music and being inducted into a Hall of Fame versus I don't like this guy. I just want to enjoy this today. I just want the buck today. You know what? I could do this for some amount of time and then I could pivot to something else. And we see this play out so that you get to the point in the 90s, which is when the Ramones get inducted into the Hall of Fame and the Misfits come back together, but not really because they want to,
No.
because they have to. They're beholden to the paycheck because they don't have any money. They blew themselves up. The nihilism of it stayed there. And they were like, well, we either, make some money and pay off all these legal and royalty fees that we incurred in our battles, or we are destitute. And so they become then slaves or beholden to this thing they created versus it leading them into their legacy.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's where we really do see the difference is this idea of why are you doing what you're doing and how do you relate to each other. I mean, I remember some years back I had an opportunity to go to a show and saw the original Misfits lineup do one of those court settlement shows that they had to do with each other in order to, evenly divide up all the royalties and everything else, which is, by the way, part of the reason why you get Misfits branded everything now, right? Is like they definitely seized upon the iconic, Crimson Ghost logo and everything else to pay off some legal fees. And I remember just like how excited I was and so many people at the show and the venue were to see the original Misfits, and then like how kind of like joyless it was in a lot of ways for the guys out on the stage versus like whenever you see the Ramones, the old footage of the Ramones and talk to people who saw them, they talked about just like the energy and the feeling of being there with them and how that really transcended any of maybe the internal struggles or the continued angst over not breaking through. And again, like we've talked about the Hall of Fame and all these things, and someone might be thinking like, oh, that's not very punk. But these guys never wanted to be punk. They just wanted to be rock and rollers, right? They just wanted to be working musicians who were respected for their art. And the punk stuff came way late for them. A lot, they looked at everything that came after them and realized like, oh, this is our legacy, really, right? But anyway, back to the point. This idea of the Misfits and why they're making their art, it's not to say that they weren't creative. It's not to say that they didn't have all the things that they needed, because they clearly did, right? The music is still so important and integral to the punk rock story. It's just that like the way that they went about being a band, I think, is part of the punk rock lore of like burning out fast and that self-destructiveness that I think oftentimes gets incorporated with punk. And it really has to just do with this idea of like, how do we connect to each other? And the Misfits just never could figure out how to do that. And I don't think Danzig as a human being has ever figured out how to do that with other people.
Yeah, too much of something can be the one downfall for them. Too much nihilism, too much self-absorption by each individual member. So the Misfits hit in a sweet spot of, I don't have to like you a lot as long as I'm in love with what we create together. And the Misfits were like, you know what? I love myself and I don't really know that I give whatever about anyone else in this band.
Totally.
And so that nihilism was too strong of a force for them to hold it together. That's the if we're talking about glue, maybe that is the solvent of the glue. There's
Yes.
no, it's too strong to overcome. So we see this in teams, any kind of team, like we've talked about before. We see this in teams where if there's enough glue, they can stay together and work together really well towards a greater good. But if there's too much toxic solvent, that's going to erode the ability of that team to work together.
Yeah.
And so that happens in bands, it happens in teams, it happens in ourselves. If we are too hard on ourselves, if we are too self-deprecating, if our self-view is too limited and too low and too far into a negative space, there's only so much we can achieve before we fall apart and we can't sustain it. And that's where I think there's a big piece of coaching metaphor for me here in looking at these bands is the Ramones were complicated and complex and not pretty in many ways. And points of time where they didn't speak at all unless they were on stage. But on stage, they could put that aside and hit another level. So we have that, and we have the Misfits being incredibly self-destructive. And we can be that same self-destructive in ourselves. We can have some glue that's the healing and the repair. I don't always have to love every choice I make, or I might make a mistake. Can I have some forgiveness to move forward is sort of the internal glue that we need. If we are too self-destructive, no amount of fortitude is going to get us to our goals until we do the work of what is the healing and repair, the glue of our own selves to be good enough to continue to move on the path we're on towards our personal growth.
Yeah. And hearing you say that, I also start to wonder, think about this idea of like passion and how passion for something that you're working towards fits in here, because both bands were really passionate about the music that they were making and the direction that they wanted to go as bands. And it kind of feels like the Ramones were able to channel that passion and that energy towards a productive outcome versus the Misfits, who almost seemed like consumed by this passion and this drive to make the music that they wanted. And so I don't think either band compromised, and I think that's important. They weren't compromising with their art. But I think this idea of being able to, like you say, manage those relationships, find a way to work together really matters here. But like, I'm kind of struck by this idea of like how passion plays into the ability to succeed, and maybe understanding sometimes that like passion doesn't equal outcome, but also passion can be a destructive force as much as it can be a creative force as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a multi-legged stool, a three-legged stool here of passion, bravery, and fortitude. And I see this frequently where someone is passionate about something, but they're too fearful to take a step or bring it into the world. Or they start and then something shows up and they overly question themselves and they can't keep going, which is undermines their fortitude. And so you need this bravery. And what we see from these two bands here and many punk bands is I don't need to know how to play my instrument, meaning I don't have to be a subject matter expertise,
Right.
but I'm passionate and I'm brave. That got them both started. The fortitude kept them going. And it wasn't self-discipline, so to speak. It wasn't any one person's fortitude. It was the fortitude that comes from the commitment to something greater than themselves as individuals. And there's a misnomer about fortitude or grit, in the words of Angela Duckworth, that we've talked about here before. It is a characteristic that humans who reach new levels have, humans who bring new things into the world that meet their own personal goals as much as possible. Yes, they have grit. But grit alone as a person is not what we think it is. It's not pull myself up by my bootstraps and be disciplined and I'm going to make it work. Much of the strength and grit is also surrounding yourself with other people and systems in order to stay the course when things are hard. So I frequently say our brain is the first social network, which is why it works. We are actually programmed to be more accountable when we are in relationship with others.
Yeah, no, totally. And that makes a lot of sense. And, I think there is that piece of, which is kind of interesting. The Ramones play into this trope of like having, the gabba gabba hey and all the people at the shows being a part of what they're doing. The Misfits do as well, but there's a distance from the Misfits with their fans. There's a distance between each other that really, I think, as I listen to you talk about grit and how we need grit in combination with others, that like kind of like makes clear why the Misfits sort of failed. I think that there's this idea maybe stemming from the working class background and how the Misfits had to overcome so many challenges that like, well, if it's going to be, it's going to be because of me, versus like the Ramones, who were able to tap into that energy of everybody else around them. And like, yes, we have to be gritty. We're going to have to continue to work on what we're working on, but we're not going to do this together, right? It's going to be our managers. It's going to be Danny Fields. It's going to be road managers. It's going to be medical personnel for when Joey has one of his myriad accidents. It's going to be, people figuring out how to, help them with the instruments. It's going to be recovering from on-stage arguments and fights. They understood they needed each other in a way that's just fundamentally different than, like it's, the band, the Ramones arguing on stage, and then, Tommy and Dee Dee hitting 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they just start playing, versus like an on-stage argument with Danzig that ends with like a riot and somebody being hit with a guitar in the crowd as people get pissed off because the band is storming off stage because they can't get along with each other. Right? I think there's something there about this idea of conflating passion and grit with positive outcome. But like what I'm hearing you say is like, that's not necessarily the case. You need to be passionate. You need to be gritty. But by themselves or contained within one person, those forces are just as likely to lead to a negative outcome or something that doesn't get you to your goal as they are to getting that positive outcome or the achievement of the goal.
Yeah, grit alone, just heaps and piles of grit, is just abrasive.
I like
it's just abrasive, right?
Yeah,
This
totally.
softening of that comes from relationship with compromise, that the grittiness is not, I'm just my own grit. It's that, by combining each other's bits and pieces and having to be mindful of other people's presence in your universe, which will be different than yours, allows that to soften a little bit. It's grit with, I don't know that I quite have the right words yet, but you sit on a sandy beach and it's gritty. You get into the ocean, there's still particulates floating, but there's a lubrication there. There's something in between those two things of you need the grit, but you just can't be the person covered in sandpaper,
right?
Because your band will fall apart, much like the Misfits. The fighting didn't have any checks and balances to it, and the grit just kept getting grittier, versus the Ramones had different personalities that allowed for sort of a bit of a mediation or a moderation to show up. Just by starting a song, it moves everyone's attention away and points it back to the greater goal. We took a sidetrack here, but now we can just get back to the greater goal.
Totally.
And not have to stay on the sidetrack.
Yeah, no, what I love about this what we're talking about right now is it's so indicative of the duality of punk and things that we've talked about so many times, which is this idea of like the commitment to self and your identity and who you are as a person, but you're not going to be happy, you're not going to be fulfilled if you're by yourself, right? Part of the reason you put on the punk rock gear or you go to the punk rock show is to be with other punks or be with other people. And there's this piece of like, punk is this ultimate no rules sort of genre and movement, but it has so many rules. It just has so many rules. And similarly, In these bands, that there's this individual desire and drive to be successful and to make the music you want to make, but you're not going to be able to do it by yourself. You got to stay in that balance, right? And just like you said with the beach, like the duality of like, I want to go to the beach and hang out and relax and be comfortable, and I'm going to do that in the sun, in the sand, and it's going to be uncomfortable, right? There's these two things that have to be in balance with each other in order for the beach day to be pleasant, or the band to be successful, or the punk scene to be complete. It's not just one thing. It's both things in balance. And I think that's that duality of punk that I think is always so fascinating.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And as we get close to rounding up or tying up this episode, I think about it's the example of the Ramones that I think is really helpful to land on with all of this, which is you have the goals, you have the vision of what you're moving towards, and you cannot actually ever predict where you're going to end up. You can pick up some instruments from a pawn shop and start playing them, have no idea you are going to create a whole genre of music that never existed before. You can only see that in retrospect. They were trying to make a buck today, a buck tomorrow, and then they were trying to make a number one hit to make the most bucks. What they birthed was a whole scene that didn't exist before, with subgenres that we're talking about here, plus many more that we're not even going to get to, at least not in this first season. Stay tuned. Nice teaser. Yes. But a reminder that, yes, to have that aspirational eye, that eye to the future, and at the same time not to hold on too tightly to that particular vision of the aspiration, because something else might be in store for you. And as I said earlier, that may be creating a whole genre of music and changing the trajectory of music, modern music as it stands, which is, I would argue, a much more legacy-leaving experience than I just want a number one hit of
Totally.
So on the weekly Billboard Top 40.
I couldn't agree with that more. Yeah.
So with that, we'll wind down. And as a reminder to me today, for sure, and I hope you, Matt, and others listening, that keeping that bigger vision, holding it loosely, bringing your own grit and fortitude and bravery to do it imperfectly and in community with others is probably the takeaway from today's conversation as we look at the juxtaposition of two bands, one that went on to leave a legacy beyond what they ever imagined, and another one that really stumbled along the way and found themselves beholden to their band more so than immortalized.
Totally. I love it. I love these conversations.
So we have some wrap-up stuff as always. We'll have in the show notes some resources and references, including the No Dogs in Space series that covers these two bands. And with that, this is the end of today's conversation on growth and life lessons through our exploration of the Misfits and the Ramones. Catch you next time.
All right. Bye.